I was washing my car in the driveway when my husband's mother, my mother-in-law, called me frantically, saying, "You have to see this, it's about the will." My hands froze as I opened the envelope and read the numbers that revealed a hidden fortune she'd been hoarding. I whispered, "You knew about the hidden bank account in my father's name all along." I felt betrayed, furious and small, but instead of breaking, I used that paper trail to trigger an investigation and take control. What happened next changed everything. I still remember that day vividly, even now, as if it were imprinted on my memory with a permanent mark of nervous anticipation and excitement. It was the first time I would meet my husband's family, the day I officially became part of a world that had existed long before I did, a world where customs, expectations, and unspoken rules dictated every interaction. I had spent the whole morning preparing, double-checking my outfit in the mirror, smoothing my hair until each strand sat perfectly in place, and rehearsing polite smiles and conversations in my head. I wanted to make a good impression, but deep down, I had a faint unease, a tiny seed of doubt that I couldn't quite shake. My husband, David, had noticed my nervous energy. He tried to reassure me with his easy smile, holding my hand tightly as we pulled up to the large, imposing house where his mother lived. "Don't worry," he whispered. "She's just particular. You'll see." I nodded, trying to absorb his words, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. I wasn't sure if particular was a warning or simply an understatement for what was waiting behind that front door. When we arrived, the driveway was lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, and a subtle but unmistakable scent of freshly cut grass hung in the air. A large, elegant car pulled up behind us, and I realized it was hers, my soon-to-be mother-in-law Margaret. She stepped out gracefully, her posture impeccable, her heels clicking against the pavement with an authority that demanded attention. Her presence was magnetic, almost intimidating, yet she smiled, revealing a carefully constructed warmth. It was the kind of smile that felt genuine at first glance, but there was a glimmer in her eyes, sharp and calculating, that whispered, "I am in control here." David squeezed my hand again and whispered, "Be nice, she's excited to meet you." I tried to return a confident smile, but as I extended my hand for a polite greeting, Margaret's grip surprised me, firm, unyielding, and just slightly cold. "So you must be the famous daughter-in-law," she said, her voice smooth but carrying a subtle undertone that made me feel like I was being tested, evaluated in ways words alone could not capture. "We've heard so much about you." I forced a polite laugh, nodding, trying to hide my rising anxiety. What had she heard? And who had told her? I wondered. Every compliment seemed measured, every word chosen carefully to establish her dominance without appearing overtly aggressive. Her house was a reflection of her personality, grand, meticulously organized, and slightly intimidating. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, casting refracted light across polished hardwood floors. The walls were adorned with family portraits that seemed to silently judge me, each smiling face frozen in time, each picture a reminder that I was stepping into a history I didn't fully understand. Margaret led us into the living room, and I couldn't help but notice the subtle tension in her posture, the way she observed my every move. It was as if she had memorized the way each daughter-in-law should behave, and she was mentally checking off the rules as I navigated her territory. I tried to make conversation, asking about her day, complimenting the house, mentioning my hobbies, anything to establish rapport. Margaret nodded politely but rarely added more than a sentence. Her eyes, however, were relentless. They scanned me as if they were peeling back layers, searching for weaknesses, testing my composure. I felt exposed, but I forced myself to stand tall, to meet her gaze evenly, even when my palms felt sweaty and my voice slightly trembled. I knew, instinctively, that this was the kind of first impression that could determine my place in this family for years to come. As the afternoon progressed, the family trickled in one by one. My husband's siblings entered with their own confident air, each greeting Margaret with a familiarity that made me feel like an outsider observing an intricate dance of family politics. There were small smiles, subtle nods, whispered comments in the corners that made me acutely aware of the social dynamics at play. I listened, careful not to interrupt, trying to memorize names, faces, and relationships. Every joke, every shared glance between Margaret and her children seemed loaded with layers of meaning, and I was desperately trying to decode the unspoken rules. Lunch was served in the formal dining room, another test of etiquette. Margaret seated herself at the head of the table, a position of authority she clearly cherished. I sat next to David, grateful for his familiar presence, yet acutely aware that I was under scrutiny. The meal was a silent battlefield of gestures and small talk. Margaret offered critiques disguised as questions. "Oh, you made this salad yourself? Interesting choice of dressing." I smiled politely, replying, "Yes, I thought it would be refreshing for today." Her lips curved slightly in approval, or perhaps it was amusement. I couldn't tell. Every compliment felt like a challenge, every nod like a verdict pending. During lunch, she began sharing stories about her children, highlighting their achievements, their intelligence, their grace. It was a subtle reminder of her influence, her ability to shape narratives, and perhaps her expectations of me. I listened carefully, interjecting occasionally, hoping to show my understanding, my willingness to be part of the family. Yet beneath it all, a quiet determination began to form inside me. I realized that this was more than a first meeting. It was a delicate negotiation of power, respect, and trust. If I wanted to survive in this family, if I wanted to carve out a place not as an outsider but as someone acknowledged and valued, I would need to be observant, patient, and strategic. By the end of the visit, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. Margaret had been polite, even warm at times, but the subtle tests, the piercing glances, and the careful measurement of my every action left an impression that lingered. As we left, David whispered, "See? She's not so bad." I nodded, but I knew deep down that not so bad didn't mean safe. There were layers yet to uncover, and secrets hidden behind the polite smile of my mother-in-law. I had stepped into her world, yes, but I also realized that to survive, I would need more than politeness. I would need strategy, patience, and perhaps a quiet determination that even she could not see coming. Walking back to the car, I glanced at the house one last time. Margaret was standing at the doorway, watching us leave, her posture flawless, her gaze unwavering. I imagined her thoughts, the quiet assessment of me that would continue long after I had gone. And in that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. I would learn her ways, observe her secrets, and one day, when the time was right, I would ensure that her underestimation of me became her greatest mistake. Little did I know, that day would come sooner than I imagined, and it would change the course of our lives forever. The day of the wedding arrived with a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and an undercurrent of tension I hadn't fully anticipated. From the moment I woke up, the air felt charged, as if the house itself knew that something monumental was about to happen. Not just the celebration of love, but a moment that would define my place in this family forever. My heart raced as I dressed in the carefully chosen gown, a soft cream with subtle gold embroidery that I hoped struck the perfect balance between elegance and humility. I wanted to be noticed but not overshadow the bride, wanted to look like I belonged, yet remain respectful to the traditions I was only beginning to understand. David came in just as I finished adjusting my hair. He looked calm, impossibly composed, though I knew he too felt the weight of the day. "You look incredible," he said, a glint of pride in his eyes. I smiled, trying to mask my nerves. "Thank you," I whispered. "I just hope everything goes smoothly." David squeezed my hand, his warmth giving me a small measure of courage. But deep down, I knew that this day wasn't just about us. It was about our families, about expectations, and about the delicate, invisible dance of approval that I would have to navigate, especially with my mother-in-law. From the moment we arrived at the venue, I felt the subtle scrutiny of her gaze. Margaret, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, had arrived early, impeccably dressed in a deep emerald green gown that highlighted her elegant posture and commanding presence. She greeted each guest with a practiced warmth, her smile perfect, yet I could feel the faint tension in her shoulders, the kind of tension that revealed control beneath the surface. As I approached, she held my hand firmly and said, "So this is the daughter-in-law I've heard so much about. Let's see if you're as perfect as they say." Her words were courteous, but I sensed an edge, a challenge hidden between the lines. I forced a polite laugh, nodding, trying to mask my unease. The ceremony itself was beautiful, almost surreal. The flowers were a sea of soft pastels, the chairs aligned perfectly, and the music, a live string quartet, filled the air with a gentle, melodic tension that seemed to mirror my own apprehension. I walked down the aisle slowly, hand in hand with David, acutely aware of every glance from the audience, every whispered comment that might reach Margaret's ears. Her eyes were on me constantly, watching, measuring, analyzing. I realized that every movement I made, every smile I gave, was being noted and stored away for future judgment. I tried to breathe evenly, smile naturally, and maintain the calm composure I had been practicing for weeks. During the vows, I noticed the subtle interactions between Margaret and the other family members. She whispered occasionally to David's father, exchanged knowing glances with siblings, and gave small nods to friends, each gesture perfectly timed and controlled. It was as if she had rehearsed this moment countless times, preparing to ensure the spotlight stayed where she wanted it, not on me, not on anyone who could challenge her influence. And yet, I couldn't help but admire her subtle mastery. There was an undeniable power in the way she commanded attention without raising her voice or overtly asserting dominance. I realized that my mother-in-law was a master of influence, and if I wanted to survive in this family, I would need to learn the rules quickly. The reception that followed was a delicate battlefield of social interactions. I was introduced to relatives I had only heard about in passing, cousins, aunts, uncles, and distant family friends, and each introduction carried an unspoken weight. "It's so lovely to finally meet you," they said, their smiles polite, yet I could sense the quiet judgment beneath. I tried to navigate each conversation carefully, listening more than speaking, asking questions to show interest, yet never revealing too much about myself. Margaret was never far from my side, her presence a constant reminder that nothing in this family was casual, nothing left to chance. Every compliment she gave me seemed calculated, every small gesture of approval carefully measured. At dinner, the table was an intricate map of family hierarchy. Margaret sat at the head, her posture rigid but regal, a symbol of authority that none dared challenge. I was seated next to David, grateful for his presence, but also painfully aware of my own visibility under her watchful eye. Conversations flowed, stories of family history, shared achievements, and light teasing, but Margaret's comments often carried hidden meanings. "Oh, you're quite talented with planning events," she said, her gaze piercing yet composed. "I do hope you can keep up with our traditions." I smiled, thanking her, but her tone suggested that I had just been tested and perhaps found lacking in some subtle way. The realization stung. Even on a day meant for celebration, I was being assessed, measured, and weighed against expectations that seemed nearly impossible to meet. Later, as speeches were given, I noticed the careful orchestration of praise. Margaret's words always elevated her children's accomplishments, subtly contrasting them with my presence, highlighting her influence in ways that no outsider might immediately notice. The daughter-in-law's role was complex. I was expected to be charming, agreeable, and supportive, yet never to outshine, never to question, and certainly never to threaten the carefully maintained balance of power. I felt the tension building inside me, not resentment exactly, but a keen awareness of the challenges I would face if I were to truly integrate into this family. By the time the dancing began, I had begun to adjust my perspective. I realized that the wedding, in all its grandeur and ceremony, was a testing ground. Each smile, each nod, each polite exchange was a piece of a larger puzzle of family dynamics. I danced carefully, laughed at jokes when appropriate, and subtly observed, noting who laughed at Margaret's comments, who remained silent, and who seemed quietly amused by the unfolding social theater. I could feel the weight of observation on my shoulders, but with each step, I began to form a plan, a mental map of the social terrain I would need to navigate to gain respect, influence, and eventually understanding. As the evening wound down, Margaret came to me again, her expression carefully neutral. "You did well tonight," she said, her words measured, almost cryptic. "We'll see how things progress from here." I nodded politely, but inside, a quiet determination began to take root. This was only the beginning. My first impressions of the wedding had taught me a critical lesson. In this family, nothing was as simple as it seemed. Every smile, every gesture, every word carried weight, and if I wanted to survive and thrive, I would need to watch, learn, and eventually find my own path to recognition and respect. Walking back to the car with David that night, I reflected on the day's events. The excitement of the wedding was still lingering, but now mixed with a complex awareness of the challenges ahead. Margaret's presence was undeniably commanding, her influence pervasive, and her subtle manipulations already apparent. And yet, a spark of resolve flickered within me. I realized that this family, for all its elegance and tradition, had cracks, hidden corners where secrets and vulnerabilities might be found. And in time, I would learn them all. I would navigate this intricate web of expectations, power and subtle control, not as a passive participant, but as someone who would one day understand the true depths of my mother-in-law's secrets, and perhaps learn to use them. Life after the wedding should have felt like a fairy tale beginning, a new chapter filled with excitement, love, and shared dreams. But instead, I quickly realized that living under the same roof, or even interacting frequently with my mother-in-law, Margaret, was like walking on a tightrope stretched over a canyon of subtle judgments, unspoken rules, and delicate, invisible tensions. Those first few weeks after the wedding were deceptively ordinary on the surface. We had dinners, casual visits, and family gatherings, yet beneath each polite conversation lay a simmering web of tests, evaluations, and small, almost imperceptible challenges. I soon discovered that family life was not only about love and support, but also about navigating the labyrinth of expectations imposed by those who wielded power in silence. Margaret had a way of making her expectations known without ever raising her voice, and her methods were both subtle and precise. At first, I thought I might be imagining things. She would comment casually on my cooking. "Oh, interesting seasoning choice, dear." "Not everyone would dare," she said one evening as I nervously served a simple chicken dish. Her tone sounded like praise on the surface, but the faint lift of an eyebrow and the way she paused before each word told a different story. It was as though she were planting doubt, assessing how I reacted under pressure, and subtly reminding me that nothing in her world was done without careful scrutiny. I tried to remain composed, smiling politely, but inside I felt a mixture of irritation, confusion, and a strange, simmering determination. Then there were the evenings spent sitting in the living room, supposedly casual, yet always charged with underlying tension. Margaret would invite friends or distant relatives over, and I would find myself caught in a delicate balancing act, laughing at jokes, nodding at stories, all while being hyper-aware of her gaze. Each story she told seemed to carry double meaning. A tale about her own cleverness, a subtle reminder of past mistakes she had prevented me from making, or a comparison between me and some other daughter-in-law from the past. I realized quickly that even casual storytelling was a test, and each comment I made, every facial expression, every laugh, was being catalogued. One afternoon, while helping set the table for lunch, a small incident occurred that perfectly illustrated the family's unspoken hierarchy. I had placed the silverware a little differently from how Margaret preferred it. She noticed immediately. "Oh, dear, I usually align the forks with the plate edges exactly like this," she said lightly, almost as if to make me feel clumsy without outright criticizing me. I felt a flush of embarrassment, but I also noticed something, a fleeting hesitation in her voice, a momentary doubt that perhaps she hadn't considered how I might improve upon her meticulous system. I quietly adjusted the forks, all the while mentally noting every detail of her habits, quirks, and preferences. Each of these small tensions became a lesson, a clue in the subtle code of her household. Family meals became the stage for these micro-conflicts. Margaret had a way of giving instructions without appearing domineering. "You know, some families prefer the napkins folded this way," she would remark casually as if speaking to herself, yet everyone present understood the implicit message. "You are being evaluated." I began noticing patterns, the way she directed conversation, her small size, the way she would shift her gaze ever so slightly when I spoke too much or too little. I started to understand that her power didn't come from loud words or angry outbursts. It came from control over perception, from manipulating the atmosphere so subtly that anyone untrained in her rules might feel perpetually off balance. These small family tensions extended beyond meals into casual interactions. On weekends, when David and I tried to spend quiet time at home, Margaret would appear with an innocent question. "Oh, I didn't know you cooked this on your own." "That's ambitious." Each word carried dual meaning, testing my reaction. Was I proud? Was I embarrassed? Was I defensive? I learned to pause, to smile thoughtfully, to absorb the comment without revealing too much. It was exhausting, a constant mental gymnastics of deciphering motives while maintaining grace and composure. Even the children in the extended family seemed to sense the tension. Cousins, nieces, and nephews watched interactions keenly, sometimes mimicking Margaret's tone, sometimes making subtle remarks that left me questioning my every move. "Oh, you let your mother-in-law help with that?" one cousin whispered as Margaret adjusted a cushion on the sofa. I smiled faintly, but I felt a pang of frustration. These micro-judgments, repeated day after day, created a sense of constant vigilance. It was a world where every action could be analyzed, every gesture interpreted, and every mistake quietly remembered for future reference. Amid these small tensions, I began to notice patterns in Margaret's behavior that revealed both her strengths and vulnerabilities. She was meticulous, organized, and socially skilled, but her need for control, her desire to be seen as the orchestrator of every interaction, also left her blind to subtle shifts that I could exploit later. Each micro-critique, each comment layered with hidden meaning, was a breadcrumb leading to a deeper understanding of her personality, her fears, and the secrets she guarded fiercely. I began to document, mentally at first, then on paper, small notes about habits, phrases she used, and moments where she revealed more than she intended. One evening, the tension reached a quiet peak. We were preparing for a family gathering, and Margaret was directing everyone in her usual composed manner, subtly asserting authority while appearing gentle and reasonable. She commented on the table settings, the lighting, and the order of seating. "I suppose some might not notice these things, but it's always better to plan ahead," she said, her voice smooth and poised. I smiled politely, nodding, but inside my mind raced. I realized then that these small tensions were not just annoyances, they were lessons in patience, observation, and strategy. Each moment of criticism, every subtle jab, was a clue to understanding the intricate web of family dynamics. It was during these moments of tension that I first began to imagine the possibility of turning the tables, not in anger, but in careful, calculated strategy. If I could learn every nuance of Margaret's behavior, every hidden preference, every secret she thought she had safely guarded, I could one day navigate the family world on my own terms. The small family tensions were no longer merely obstacles. They were the foundation of a plan, a quiet build-up to the eventual discovery that would change everything. By the end of those first months, I had begun to develop an internal map of the family hierarchy, noting alliances, observing patterns of behavior, and cataloging moments where Margaret's meticulous control hinted at vulnerabilities. Every casual dinner, every polite exchange, every gentle critique contributed to my understanding. The tensions were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but I had learned to meet them with grace, patience, and silent observation. The daughter-in-law role was challenging, yes, but it was also a training ground, a subtle proving ground for resilience, intelligence, and strategic thinking. And even as I navigated these small family tensions, I began to notice something remarkable. Beneath Margaret's carefully constructed exterior, there were cracks, moments where her guard slipped, small gestures that betrayed insecurities, and tiny secrets she believed were hidden. These cracks, once invisible to the casual observer, became my guide. I realized that one day, these small tensions, these subtle judgments, these carefully orchestrated tests could be used, not to humiliate, not to retaliate in anger, but to uncover the truth, to assert a quiet justice, and perhaps to achieve a sense of satisfaction that only comes when hidden truths are finally revealed. The small family tensions, at first irritating and exhausting, had transformed into a rich tapestry of observation, strategy, and preparation. I understood now that patience was not passive. Watching, listening, and understanding the subtle dynamics of a household were active, deliberate steps toward a goal that had not yet arrived but was slowly taking shape in my mind. And with each passing day, I became more adept, more aware, and more quietly confident that the time would come when these tensions would no longer be minor frustrations, they would be the foundation of a revelation that could change everything. It was during one of those seemingly ordinary family gatherings that the truth of favoritism began to reveal itself in ways I hadn't yet fully understood. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence, imagining perhaps that I was imagining patterns where none existed. But as I observed more closely, a subtle, unmistakable hierarchy became painfully clear. Margaret, my mother-in-law, wielded her influence with a delicate, almost invisible hand, giving preferences that no one else seemed to notice but that shaped the room like invisible threads pulling the family into a dance of inequality. The realization hit me slowly at first, like a drop of water on bare skin, gentle, but persistent, and eventually undeniable. We had gathered for a Sunday lunch, a ritual that had already begun to feel like a small minefield of social interactions. The dining table was set beautifully, with porcelain plates, polished silverware, and crystal glasses that sparkled under the soft afternoon light streaming through the living room windows. Margaret, as always, presided at the head of the table with her posture impeccable, her every movement radiating control and confidence. At first glance, she seemed merely attentive, ensuring that everyone was comfortable, that the food was served properly, that the room was pleasant. But as the meal unfolded, the patterns became impossible to ignore. I noticed it first with her compliments. She would lean slightly toward her eldest son's wife, Sarah, with a smile that was warm and approving, and say things like, "Oh, Sarah, your pie is simply divine. You must share your recipe with the family." The words were perfectly kind on the surface, yet the undertone was unmistakable favoritism. Then, when my own dish, meticulously prepared and presented with care, was brought to her attention, she nodded politely, "Yes, that's nice," and immediately turned her attention elsewhere. The contrast was subtle, but the weight of it was undeniable. Every small act of attention, every smile, every approving word, was being carefully distributed to reinforce a hierarchy I hadn't yet realized existed. Even the seating arrangements revealed her strategy. Cousins who had done exactly nothing to merit attention were placed close to Margaret's side, given the best view of the family, while others, like myself, were subtly shifted further down the table, near windows or side chairs, where visibility and influence were limited. The physical placement of each person mirrored the invisible ranking Margaret had established, and I could feel its effects radiating across the room. Those in favored positions laughed more freely, spoke more confidently, and even seemed to absorb Margaret's authority as though it were a protective shield, while those less favored hesitated, their voices quieter, their smiles more cautious. By the middle of the meal, it became impossible to ignore how Margaret's favoritism extended beyond mere words and seating. She would guide conversations towards certain people, asking them questions that allowed them to shine, while redirecting others, including myself, to more mundane or less flattering topics. "Tell us about your new project, John," she said, leaning forward with an encouraging smile. Then she glanced at me briefly, her gaze polite but fleeting, and said, "And you, dear, have you been busy too?" The difference in energy was palpable. The favored children-in-law were given the stage. I was given a polite nod, and the spotlight moved on. The effect was subtle but powerful. It created a social reality where approval was earned not by merit, but by proximity to Margaret's favor. I began to notice patterns over time, in the way she spoke, moved, and even in the glances she cast across the room. Sarah, the favored daughter-in-law, received extra attention during storytelling. Margaret laughed slightly louder at her jokes, shared small, intimate anecdotes, and provided small privileges, first choice of desserts, guidance in meal preparations, and private words of encouragement. Meanwhile, my contributions, no matter how polished or thoughtful, were met with restrained approval or brief acknowledgement before attention shifted to someone else. It was a delicate form of social manipulation, one that reinforced her influence and left me constantly aware of my own positioning within the family. One day, the reality hit me more vividly than ever before. Margaret had invited her close friends over for tea, a small, seemingly harmless gathering. As I poured the tea and offered biscuits, I noticed how carefully she orchestrated every detail: seating, conversation, laughter. She leaned towards Sarah, whispering a compliment that seemed to illuminate the room, while I stood nearby, my words barely acknowledged. I realized in that moment that favoritism was not random or casual. It was deliberate, carefully calculated, and used to assert her influence while subtly reminding everyone else of their place. Even small gifts revealed the pattern. Birthdays, holidays, and special occasions were meticulously monitored. Favored children-in-law received personalized attention, thoughtful presents, and handwritten notes that revealed intimate knowledge of their preferences. I, by contrast, would receive polite acknowledgments or generic gifts, as if my presence mattered, but not enough to merit the depth of care others received. This favoritism was not cruel in a maliciously overt way. It was subtle, insidious, and emotionally powerful. Each slight, each deliberate preference, created a quiet imbalance that affected the self-esteem and confidence of those not favored. As I watched and listened, I began to understand Margaret's motivations. Favoritism was a tool of control. By selectively distributing attention, approval, and care, she reinforced her authority while quietly ensuring that others remained cautious, self-conscious, and deferential. It was a lesson in power dynamics, subtly reinforced through every interaction, every meal, every casual remark. And for me, this revelation was crucial. It explained the undercurrent of tension I had felt since my first visit, and it illuminated the path forward. I began to take mental notes, recording the small favors, gestures, and signs of preference that Margaret exhibited. These weren't just quirks, they were patterns, behaviors that could be studied, understood, and eventually anticipated. I realized that if I wanted to survive, and eventually thrive, within this family, I needed to understand these patterns in minute detail. Favoritism was not just a minor annoyance. It was a roadmap, a guide to navigating the delicate balance of influence and approval within Margaret's carefully constructed world. By the end of the afternoon, a quiet determination settled within me. I would not allow favoritism to define my place or diminish my value. I would observe, learn, and prepare, patiently waiting for the right moment to assert my presence in ways that Margaret would never anticipate. I would continue to play the part of the attentive, respectful daughter-in-law, but beneath the surface, I was building awareness, strategy, and a readiness to respond to the subtle injustices I had discovered. And as we left that gathering, I glanced at Margaret, her eyes sharp, her smile composed, unaware that her favoritism had revealed far more than she intended. The seeds of understanding and the potential for future action were planted that day. I realized that in her desire to control and favor some over others, she had unwittingly provided the insight I needed to navigate the family hierarchy and perhaps one day to uncover and use the secrets that she guarded so fiercely. The discovery of favoritism had begun as a quiet, almost imperceptible realization. By the time I left that afternoon, it had become a foundation for understanding, strategy, and the subtle power plays that defined my mother-in-law's world. And while it might have seemed minor to an outsider, to me, it was a revelation, one that would shape the path forward and quietly, inexorably, lead toward the eventual unearthing of truths she had thought were safely hidden. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the world seems to move just a little slower, allowing every detail to sharpen in stark relief. I had been tidying the kitchen after lunch, humming a small tune to myself, when David stepped into the room with a letter in hand. He looked uneasy, the kind of unease that I had grown to recognize as something deeper than mere worry. It was the subtle tremor of someone about to reveal a truth long hidden. I think this is important," he said quietly, placing the envelope on the counter between us. His hands lingered over it, almost as if he were weighing the gravity of what it contained. The envelope was thick and slightly worn, with neat handwriting across the front, addressed to Margaret. I froze as I realized that this was no ordinary correspondence. My heart began to beat faster, a mix of curiosity, fear, and anticipation coursing through me. I looked at David, and he nodded ever so slightly, giving me permission, or perhaps a silent warning, "Open it." I carefully lifted the flap, the paper inside crisp and slightly yellowed with age, and began to unfold it. The words on the document made my chest tighten. It was a bank statement, a detailed ledger showing a hidden account in my father's name. The numbers were staggering, revealing a fortune that had been kept secret from the family for years. I read through the entries repeatedly, my hands shaking as I tried to comprehend what I was seeing. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. The sum seemed almost unreal, and yet there they were, carefully documented and meticulously hidden. "You knew about this all along," I whispered, my voice barely audible, directed at the shadow of Margaret who, unknown to me, had just entered the kitchen silently. Margaret froze, her composure faltering for the briefest moment, and I saw it, the subtle flinch, the rapid blink, the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice calm but with a tremor beneath the surface that betrayed her practiced facade. I had caught her, finally. I could see the calculation behind her smile, the years of careful planning and secrecy unraveling in the span of a heartbeat. The knowledge that she had deliberately hidden this fortune, manipulating information and controlling who knew what, sent a shiver of both anger and determination through me. I remember looking at David, whose face was pale, a mixture of shock and betrayal reflected in his eyes. "Mom, why?" he asked, the question simple but loaded with years of frustration, confusion, and now disbelief. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope, but I stepped back, blocking her reach. The power dynamic had shifted, even in that fleeting moment. She had maintained control for decades, hidden her secrets, and manipulated perception, but now, the revelation had shattered her invisible shield. As I read further into the documents, it became clear that this wasn't a small oversight or a minor act of secrecy. The account had been accumulating interest, dividends, and investments, all deliberately kept from the rest of the family. She had maintained meticulous records, ensuring that no one would accidentally stumble upon the truth. The realization made my blood boil. Here was a woman who had outwardly presented herself as the loving, concerned mother-in-law, all while hoarding wealth and knowledge that could have changed lives if revealed sooner. The injustice was overwhelming, but amidst the anger, a quiet, calculating clarity began to form within me. It was at that precise moment that I realized the depth of her manipulation. The favoritism I had observed, the subtle tests, the micro-criticisms, all of it was connected. Margaret had been orchestrating perception, controlling narratives, and manipulating relationships to maintain power, all while hiding this enormous fortune. Every subtle jab, every preferential gesture, every innocent remark now made sense in a new, frighteningly intricate way. She wasn't just controlling appearances, she was controlling reality itself, ensuring that no one could challenge her authority or uncover her secrets. And yet, even as the shock and anger coursed through me, I noticed something else, a small but undeniable flaw. In her meticulous attention to detail, in her careful orchestration of appearances, she had left traces, breadcrumbs of her own making, that could be observed, studied, and eventually leveraged. Every ledger entry, every carefully dated note, every account statement was a reflection of her methodical habits. While the secret itself had been hidden, the pattern of secrecy revealed opportunities. If I paid attention, I could understand how she operated, predict her actions, and perhaps even use her own systems against her when the time came. For the first time, I felt the stirrings of what would become my plan. This wasn't about petty revenge or momentary satisfaction. It was about justice, about balance, and about reclaiming agency in a family where control had long been one-sided. I could see it all so clearly now. The small tests, the favoritism, the subtle criticisms, they were all preparatory moves, setting the stage for her dominance. But the discovery of this secret changed everything. Now, I had knowledge she hadn't anticipated, a tool she had never considered would be in my hands. The weight of the secret settled over the room like a heavy fog, thick with tension and unspoken truths. Margaret's eyes met mine, a mixture of alarm and calculation, as if she were assessing whether I would act immediately or quietly retreat. I understood that she was dangerous, not overtly, but with a patience and subtlety honed over decades. She could manipulate, charm, and control with a smile, yet here she was, confronted with the very thing she had sought to conceal. Her composure was cracking ever so slightly, and I knew, in that fleeting moment, that I had crossed a threshold. The balance of power had begun to shift. David, torn between loyalty to his mother and the shock of the revelation, looked to me. What do we do now?" he asked, voice hesitant, almost fearful. I knew the answer, but it wasn't simple. There would be no impulsive confrontation, no rash decisions. This was about patience, observation, and strategy. Margaret had underestimated me from the very beginning, And this first revelation was my leverage. I would not squander it. The envelope, the account, the years of hidden wealth, these were more than just numbers. They were the beginning of a shift, a slow but inevitable transformation in our family's dynamic, one that I could influence if I chose my actions carefully. As I carefully refolded the papers and placed them back in the envelope, I felt a quiet determination settle over me. The first secret had been revealed, the truth laid bare, and with it came the realization that I had a path forward. Margaret's carefully constructed facade was cracking, and now I had insight into the methods she had relied upon for decades. I understood the subtle mechanics of her control, and the possibilities that knowledge unlocked were dizzying. This was only the beginning, the first piece of a puzzle that, when fully assembled, could shift the entire family dynamic, and perhaps, finally, bring justice to the quiet injustices I had endured as the overlooked daughter-in-law. Even as Margaret left the room, attempting to regain her composure, I knew that the knowledge I now possessed had irrevocably altered our relationship. The secret, once hidden and impenetrable, had been uncovered, and with it, a quiet, simmering sense of possibility began to grow inside me, a possibility that I could turn years of manipulation, favoritism, and quiet domination on its head, using the very secrets she had guarded so fiercely against her own advantage. The first revelation was over, but our story was only just beginning. The days following the revelation of my mother-in-law's secret were a tempest of emotions that I hadn't anticipated. At first, there was disbelief, a quiet, almost fragile shock that seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on every interaction I had with Margaret, David, and the rest of the family. Each meal, each conversation, and every polite gesture now carried a new weight, tinged with the knowledge that an invisible ledger of deceit had existed under the very roof we all called home. I could feel it in the way I moved, in the way I spoke, and in the way I scrutinized every glance Margaret cast my way. That revelation had ignited a spark, one that began quietly but steadily, growing into a simmering heat that I could no longer ignore. It was a Friday evening when the moment of true indignation arrived, a day that, on the surface, seemed no different than any other, but beneath its ordinary exterior, tension hung heavy like storm clouds ready to break. Margaret had invited several extended family members over for dinner, a casual gathering that I now knew was anything but casual. Her smile was immaculate, her movements elegant and controlled, yet every gesture carried an unspoken message. This was her domain, and every guest was merely performing according to her carefully curated script. I arrived, as usual, prepared to navigate the labyrinth of social expectations with grace, but inside, I was seething with a quiet, controlled fury. As I greeted her, she leaned in slightly, whispering with a practiced softness, "I hope you've adjusted well since the wedding. We must all keep things orderly, you know." Her words sounded innocent enough, but I recognized the subtle jab, a reminder of my place, a hint that she still held the reins of authority. I smiled politely, nodding, but beneath that smile, a storm raged. Every memory of favoritism, every calculated test, and now the secret she had tried so desperately to conceal, surged through my mind, coalescing into a profound sense of indignation. It was not just the deceit that angered me, it was the years of manipulation, the careful orchestration of perception, and the relentless assertion of control over my life and those I cared about. Dinner began as meticulously as Margaret had intended. The table was a perfect arrangement of polished silverware, crisp linens, and carefully chosen centerpieces that reflected her taste and attention to detail. Guests were seated according to a hierarchy I had come to understand too well, the favored enjoying subtle privileges while others, including myself, were relegated to positions of less influence. Margaret engaged in conversations with precision, her laughter timed perfectly, her compliments selective, and her criticisms hidden behind layers of civility. Each word, each glance, each gesture was a calculated maneuver to maintain dominance. And yet, knowing the secret she had tried to keep hidden, the secret she thought no one could uncover, gave me a newfound clarity. It was during the serving of dessert that the moment arrived, subtle yet undeniable. Margaret was praising Sarah, her favorite daughter-in-law, for a perfectly executed lemon tart. "Simply exquisite, Sarah," she said, leaning slightly closer, her voice carrying warmth that I knew was reserved for selective ears. I smiled politely, placing my own dessert plate in front of me when David leaned in and whispered, "Mom's still managing everything, isn't she?" His voice was low, tinged with disbelief and a hint of frustration. I nodded, my own indignation growing. This was more than favoritism. It was a constant assertion of control, a systematic manipulation of everyone around her, reinforced by secrecy and selective transparency. As the evening progressed, the indignation simmered inside me, intertwining with a growing sense of purpose. I recalled the hidden bank account, the careful documentation of wealth that had been deliberately concealed, and every subtle test and slight she had imposed upon me since my first entry into this family. I realized that my anger, my sense of injustice, was not merely emotional, it was strategic. Each indignity, each orchestrated act of control, each subtle slight, had revealed patterns, vulnerabilities, and openings that I could later use to navigate and eventually confront the web of secrets she had so meticulously spun. Margaret's eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered briefly toward me as I engaged politely in conversation with other family members. I could see the faint tightening of her jaw, the almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes. She was sensing the shift, though she could not yet place it. My indignation was not an outburst. It was silent, controlled, and dangerous in its quiet intensity. I was aware, fully aware, of the power that knowledge gave me. I had discovered the first secret, understood the hierarchy, and now felt the simmering need for justice, the desire to restore balance in a system that had long been skewed in Margaret's favor. In that moment, my indignation transformed into a plan. The quiet fury inside me sharpened my focus, helping me catalog every detail of Margaret's behavior, every pattern of favoritism, every method of subtle manipulation. I began to see the invisible map of her control laid bare before my mind's eye, a detailed blueprint of how power was exercised, maintained, and protected within this family. Each small gesture, every carefully constructed compliment, every selective approval, was now a piece of a puzzle that I could observe, understand, and eventually influence. The intensity of my indignation grew when I noticed how other family members unconsciously reinforced her control. They laughed at her jokes, deferred to her comments, and perpetuated the hierarchy she had built with meticulous care. The injustice of it all, the way influence was wielded selectively, the way knowledge was hoarded, the subtle oppression disguised as etiquette, stoked the fire inside me. It was no longer merely a personal affront. It was a systemic imbalance that demanded careful consideration, strategy, and patience to address. As the evening wore on, I excused myself briefly, stepping into the kitchen to compose my thoughts. Alone, I traced the edges of the envelope containing the hidden account statements, feeling the weight of knowledge in my hands. The indignation within me was no longer merely a reaction. It had become a catalyst, a force that focused my mind on the larger picture. I understood that Margaret's dominance could be challenged, that her secrets could be leveraged, and that justice, quiet, deliberate, and undeniable, could eventually be enacted. Returning to the table, I carried a calm facade, smiling and nodding at casual remarks, while the storm of indignation continued to churn beneath the surface. Each interaction, each small exchange, now felt like a rehearsal for the moments to come. I knew that the day would arrive when Margaret's secrets, and the subtle injustices she had imposed, could no longer remain hidden. And in that knowledge, the indignation transformed into a quiet satisfaction, a sense of purpose, a roadmap toward reclaiming balance and asserting influence within a family long dominated by her careful orchestration. By the time dessert concluded and the guests departed, I felt the full weight of the moment. The indignation was no longer raw or aimless. It was refined, deliberate, and strategic. I had seen the truth, felt the injustice, and understood the patterns of control. And as Margaret bid me a polite, controlled farewell, I smiled inwardly, knowing that the next steps, carefully planned and executed, would draw upon the knowledge gained in that simmering moment of indignation. This was not the end, but a pivotal turning point, a moment where awareness, emotion, and strategy converged, setting the stage for the eventual reckoning that was quietly, inevitably approaching. After the initial shock of discovering Margaret's secret and feeling the searing indignation that followed, I retreated into quiet contemplation. The revelation of the hidden bank account, coupled with the subtle favoritism and control she had exercised over years, created a storm within me, a mix of anger, disbelief, and an almost intoxicating sense of opportunity. I realized that any action taken in haste could backfire, but careful, deliberate planning could not only restore balance, but also assert my presence in a family long dominated by Margaret's silent authority. This was not impulsive revenge. It was a careful, meticulous orchestration, a game of strategy in which every move would be calculated, every gesture precise, and every reaction anticipated. I began by observing Margaret more closely than ever before. I watched her routines, her conversations, the way she interacted with each family member, and even the smallest of gestures, how she positioned her hands when speaking, the subtle tilts of her head when judging someone silently, the patterns in her laughter, and the moments when her composure briefly faltered. Each detail was crucial, a small puzzle piece revealing not only her power but also her vulnerabilities. I kept mental notes at first, cataloging her habits and tendencies. Then, I began documenting everything meticulously on paper, creating charts and timelines, tracking her interactions, her favoritism, and most importantly, the way she concealed her secrets. Margaret's hidden account, the ultimate symbol of her control, became the centerpiece of my planning. I studied it relentlessly, noting every entry, every deposit, and every withdrawal. I traced patterns, identified inconsistencies, and began connecting dots between her financial maneuvers and her social manipulations. Each subtle favoritism, every carefully orchestrated compliment, and every strategic silence now revealed a deeper motive, and I started to see how her wealth and influence were intertwined with her power over the family. The realization was electrifying. This was not just about money, it was about control, perception, and leverage, all of which I could exploit if I remained patient and precise. In addition to observing Margaret, I also began cultivating my own subtle influence within the household. I strengthened bonds with family members who had previously been overlooked or undervalued, listening intently to their stories, fears, and frustrations. I asked questions that encouraged honesty, and I shared carefully chosen details about my own life to build trust. Slowly, I began positioning myself as a confidant, someone reliable, empathetic, and discreet. Margaret, in her focus on favored individuals, rarely noticed these connections forming, which gave me an unspoken advantage. Every relationship I nurtured became another thread in the quiet web of influence I was weaving, threads that Margaret had never anticipated. During this phase of planning, I also studied the subtleties of communication, how Margaret relayed information, how she interpreted questions, and how she manipulated perceptions. I learned to read her expressions, her pauses, and even the nuances in her tone. I began practicing subtle techniques of mirroring her behavior, matching her social cues without overtly mimicking, so as to understand her mindset from the inside. Each conversation became an experiment, a way to test hypotheses about her strategies, all while maintaining the facade of an obedient, compliant daughter-in-law. The deeper I delved, the more I realized that my own silence and composure could be powerful tools. While she wielded secrecy as a weapon, I could use patience and observation to mine truths she thought were safe. At night, I would sit alone in the quiet of our home, reviewing the documents, retracing interactions, and replaying conversations in my mind. I asked myself pointed questions. Where was she vulnerable? How did she react under pressure? Which family members were most susceptible to her influence? And which could be allies if approached correctly? With each reflection, the outline of a plan began to form, a careful strategy for reclaiming control and exposing her secrets without ever revealing my own intentions prematurely. It was chess, not checkers, and I was determined to think several moves ahead. I also realized that patience would be my most powerful weapon. Immediate action, born of raw anger, could alert her, provoke defensive maneuvers, and ultimately ruin my chance for long-term influence. Instead, I embraced the strategy of quiet observation, incremental influence, and selective disclosure. Every seemingly insignificant interaction, every small act of politeness or compliance, was a calculated move designed to build trust while simultaneously gathering information. Margaret believed she was always 3 steps ahead, but in truth, I was silently studying her, learning her rhythms, and preparing a series of moves that she could not predict. Part of the planning involved anticipating contingencies. I considered every possible reaction Margaret might have if she discovered I knew about the account, or if any of my strategies were exposed prematurely. I mapped out potential risks, noting family dynamics, alliances, and conflicts. Each scenario was carefully analyzed, and for each, I prepared subtle countermeasures that would ensure I remained in control of the narrative. This was not impulsive revenge. It was strategic justice, the kind that would unfold like clockwork, ensuring maximum impact without alerting her to my intentions until the moment was perfect. I also began experimenting with small, seemingly innocuous acts that allowed me to test boundaries. I would offer advice or make suggestions subtly, observing how Margaret reacted. Sometimes she ignored me, sometimes she interjected with mild correction, but each interaction revealed more about her control tactics and insecurities. These small tests were invaluable. They allowed me to gauge the exact limits of her patience and the methods she used to maintain authority, all while keeping my presence understated and non-threatening. Every insight became a tool in my growing arsenal, a weapon forged in silence and precision. Meanwhile, I continued maintaining the public facade of the dutiful daughter-in-law. I smiled at her compliments, offered assistance when asked, and never revealed the depth of my awareness. This duality, outward compliance paired with inward vigilance, required constant attention and discipline, but it was essential to the success of the plan. Margaret's perception of control was unshakable, but by maintaining the appearance of subservience, I could observe without obstruction, influence without detection, and gather intelligence that would prove invaluable when the time for action arrived. I also began to envision the emotional impact of the eventual revelation. Margaret had relied on secrecy not only to maintain her financial advantage, but to assert dominance over the family psychologically. By understanding this, I could anticipate the exact reactions, the subtle fractures in her confidence, and the ripple effects throughout the family network. The silent revenge would not be a public spectacle. It would be a carefully executed series of revelations, timed perfectly to maximize understanding, accountability, and emotional clarity. The goal was not humiliation. It was balance, justice, and the quiet satisfaction of exposing truths that had long been obscured. Throughout this meticulous preparation, I documented every observation, every pattern, every clue. The ledger of secrets, favoritism, and social dynamics became a map, guiding me toward the eventual culmination of the plan. I imagined the moment when Margaret would realize that her secrets were no longer hidden, when her carefully orchestrated power would be challenged by knowledge she had underestimated. The anticipation was intoxicating, not out of malice, but out of the deep satisfaction that comes from strategy, patience, and understanding the intricate mechanics of influence and control. By the end of weeks spent in silent observation, careful analysis, and strategic planning, I had constructed a blueprint for action. Every detail of Margaret's habits, every interaction pattern, every secret and subtle manipulation was catalogued, studied, and prepared for leverage. The plan was not yet in motion, but the foundation was laid, a silent, unstoppable momentum building beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to shift the balance of power, reveal hidden truths, and reclaim a sense of justice within a family long dominated by secrecy and subtle tyranny. In that quiet, determined space, I felt a profound sense of control. The first secret had been discovered, the indignation had sharpened my focus, and now the silent revenge was taking form. Not impulsive, not reckless, but deliberate, patient, and meticulous. Margaret, for all her planning, could not anticipate the quiet strategy unfolding beneath her nose. And as I reviewed my notes one final time before bed, a slow, steady resolve settled in my chest. The time for action would come, and when it did, it would be precise, calculated, and utterly transformative. The day of the funeral arrived with a heaviness that seemed to seep into every corner of the house, the sky a dull gray, reflecting the weight of the moment. I remember waking early, the room quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the nightstand. The scent of rain lingered faintly in the air, a subtle reminder of the somberness to come. It was my father-in-law, Robert, whose passing had sent shockwaves through the family, though I had long suspected that beneath the mourning, deeper tensions and hidden truths would surface. Little did I know, this funeral would be the moment that would redefine everything: relationships, perceptions, and the intricate power dynamics that Margaret had so carefully cultivated over decades. The family began to gather slowly, arriving in subdued, respectful attire that contrasted sharply with the internal storms each of us carried. Margaret, poised as always, wore black silk that caught the faint light of a cloudy morning, her jewelry understated but deliberate, a subtle display of wealth and status even in mourning. She moved with precision, her composure seemingly unshakable, yet I could sense the underlying anxiety, the tiny fissures in her carefully constructed facade. I had observed these cracks before, but in the context of the funeral, they were magnified, their presence both tantalizing and revealing. As we approached the funeral home, the subtle dynamics began immediately. Margaret's favorite children-in-law, including Sarah, were given positions of prominence near the front row, while others, including myself, were seated slightly further back, where observation and influence were limited. Every detail, from seating to procession, was orchestrated, reflecting her unspoken hierarchy. The funeral director, unaware of these undercurrents, led us through the formalities, but I noticed every glance, every adjustment, every whispered instruction Margaret issued. It was all part of a silent performance, one she had perfected over decades to assert dominance and control in social settings. The ceremony began with a muted solemnity. The preacher's voice carried softly through the room, recounting Robert's life with reverence, though there was a subtle undertone of tension among the family. As I watched Margaret, I realized how deeply intertwined her sense of control was with the family's perception of propriety and tradition. Every nod, every tear, every measured sigh was calculated to project a narrative of the ideal grieving widow, yet beneath it all, there was a quiet manipulation. She was directing emotion, influence, and attention even in this sacred space. My indignation flared quietly, tempered by the need for strategy, but the knowledge I had gained over the past weeks gave me both clarity and patience. It was during the eulogy that the first cracks truly appeared. One of Margaret's distant cousins, unaware of the undercurrents, casually mentioned Robert's meticulous financial planning, noting that he had left specific instructions and documents for the family regarding his estate. The room stiffened, and I noticed a fleeting expression on Margaret's face, something between alarm and calculation, a split second of vulnerability she could not entirely conceal. The hidden bank account, the very secret that had ignited my quiet strategy, suddenly became more than an internal revelation. It had now entered the periphery of others' awareness, though no one yet understood its full significance. As the casket was lowered, I felt a wave of emotion that was impossible to ignore. The finality of Robert's passing, combined with the tension simmering beneath the surface, created a charged atmosphere. Margaret stood rigidly, hands clasped, eyes glistening with controlled tears, projecting the image of stoic mourning. But I could see the micro-expressions, her slight tremor, the tightening of her lips, the subtle furrow of her brow. It was in these moments, silent and fleeting, that the layers of her control began to thin, revealing the human vulnerability she worked so hard to conceal. My own feelings were conflicted, grief for Robert, indignation at Margaret, and an acute awareness that the dynamics of power were shifting before my eyes. After the ceremony, we moved to the family estate for the traditional gathering, a mix of remembrance and social maneuvering. Margaret, as expected, took center stage, directing conversations, offering condolences, and subtly asserting her authority over the arrangements. Yet, amidst the formalities, there were glimpses of tension that others were beginning to sense. The careful manipulation could not entirely mask the undercurrents of secrecy and favoritism. I observed each interaction with deliberate focus, noting alliances, reactions, and subtle shifts in attention. Every gesture, every conversation, was a piece of the puzzle, a clue to how the family hierarchy functioned and how it could be influenced. It was during a private conversation with David, while the others were momentarily distracted by refreshments, that the true emotional weight of the situation became clear. "Mom, she's more complicated than I thought," he whispered, a mixture of frustration and awe in his tone. I nodded, understanding the delicate balance of emotions at play. Margaret's dominance had been meticulously cultivated over decades, but now, the cracks were visible. The secret account, the favoritism, the subtle manipulations, all of it intersected with the grief of the moment, creating an environment ripe for revelation and change. My strategy, carefully crafted in silence, could now find its first opportunities in this charged atmosphere. As the afternoon progressed, small incidents began to highlight the tension. A misplaced document, a poorly timed comment, a misinterpreted gesture, all magnified by the high emotional stakes of the funeral, created moments of unspoken conflict. Margaret, ever the orchestrator, attempted to maintain control, but I could see her calculating, recalculating, and adjusting in real time. The tension was palpable, a mixture of grief, fear, and anticipation, as if the very air held the possibility of revelation. And I realized that the funeral, far from being merely a moment of mourning, had become a crucible, a place where truths could emerge, loyalties could be tested, and the foundations of influence could shift irrevocably. During the final moments of the gathering, as the sun dipped behind heavy clouds, casting a gray glow over the estate, I witnessed Margaret in a rare state of hesitation. She consulted her notes, whispered instructions to her aides, and paused more than once before speaking to a family member. The facade of control, so meticulously maintained, faltered for just enough time to reveal the vulnerability I had been waiting for. In that suspended moment, I understood that the careful planning of my silent revenge could now enter a new phase. The emotional weight of the funeral, combined with the subtle cracks in Margaret's authority, had created an environment where the hidden truths I had discovered could begin to influence the family's reality. By the time we departed, the storm clouds overhead mirrored the turbulence that had unfolded inside. The funeral had shifted something fundamental. Relationships, perceptions, and the balance of power were no longer as static as they had been. Margaret, for all her careful orchestration, had been exposed, not directly, but subtly, by circumstance and the unintentional revelations of others. And as I walked alongside David, the envelope containing the hidden account secure in my mind and heart, I felt a quiet sense of anticipation. The funeral had changed everything. It was no longer just about secrets, favoritism, or silent observation. It was about opportunity, timing, and the inevitability of consequences that Margaret had long believed she controlled. In the days following the funeral, I reflected on every interaction, every fleeting glance, and every carefully concealed emotion I had observed. The knowledge of the secret account, combined with Margaret's subtle vulnerabilities revealed during the funeral, formed the foundation for the next steps of my plan. The family, now emotionally raw, was more perceptive, more reactive, and unknowingly aligned with the forces that could shift the balance of power. The funeral had been both an ending and a beginning, a pivotal moment that would set into motion the carefully orchestrated chain of events leading toward justice, revelation, and ultimately revenge. The days following the funeral were a delicate balance between outward composure and inward calculation. Margaret, still maintaining her meticulously constructed facade of control, seemed more alert, more measured in her interactions, but beneath that mask, I sensed tension. It was as though the funeral, with all its quiet upheavals, had rattled even her unwavering confidence. I watched her carefully, cataloging every slight hesitation, every micro-expression, and every subtle overcompensation in her demeanor. Each observation was critical, a piece of intelligence I could use when the time for action arrived. But in the midst of this tension, a surprise began to emerge, a possibility I had not fully anticipated, unexpected allies within the family itself. It started with my husband, David. I had long known him as caring, kind, and deeply loyal, yet there were times when he seemed oblivious to the subtleties of Margaret's control. But after the funeral, I noticed a shift. His questions grew more pointed, tinged with curiosity and quiet frustration. "Mom's been controlling for so long," he said one evening as we reviewed documents left by Robert, his voice low and reflective. "I always thought she was just careful, but now I see it differently." There was something in his tone, a spark of realization, a willingness to observe critically rather than accept the status quo, that indicated he could be more than a passive participant. He could, in fact, become an ally, subtly supporting the strategic moves I had begun planning. Then there was Sarah, the daughter-in-law who had previously enjoyed Margaret's favoritism. At first, I had viewed her as a competitor, someone whose proximity to influence made her a potential obstacle. But the funeral had shifted dynamics, exposing cracks in Margaret's careful orchestration. During a quiet conversation, away from the watchful eyes of Margaret, Sarah admitted with a sigh, "Sometimes I feel like I don't really know her, like I'm part of a performance I didn't audition for." Her confession, whispered but unmistakable, revealed an unguarded awareness that had previously been hidden behind compliant smiles. It was a subtle but powerful alignment of perception. Two women who recognized the same patterns, who understood the quiet injustices Margaret had imposed, and who could, if approached carefully, support one another. I realized that alliances would need to be cultivated with patience and discretion. Open confrontation was impossible at this stage. Margaret's vigilance remained formidable. Instead, I approached these potential allies with subtlety, sharing just enough observations to build understanding, asking questions that encouraged reflection, and listening intently as they voiced frustrations they had previously kept buried. Each conversation became an opportunity to gauge their awareness, their willingness to act, and their capacity to influence the family dynamic without alerting Margaret. Unexpectedly, even the younger generation became a source of insight. David's teenage cousin, Lily, was perceptive beyond her years, noticing small discrepancies in Margaret's stories and behaviors. One afternoon, as we organized old family albums in the living room, Lily remarked casually, "Why did Grandma hide all these letters from everyone? I don't understand why she wouldn't tell Dad." Her words, simple but insightful, revealed an intuitive awareness of secrecy and control that even adults overlooked. I encouraged her observations with gentle questions, allowing her insights to emerge without ever revealing my own agenda. In doing so, I began to create a network of subtle intelligence within the family, allies who could provide information, perspective, and influence when needed. As these quiet alliances formed, I also realized the importance of trust and discretion. Each interaction, each shared insight, was carefully measured. There could be no overt gestures, no obvious coordination. Margaret's acute perception of control meant that any hint of alignment could provoke defensiveness, manipulation, or countermeasures. Instead, I nurtured subtle connections, allowing awareness and alignment to grow organically. With David, Sarah, and even perceptive younger members like Lily, I began constructing an invisible web of understanding, influence, and eventual leverage. The power of these unexpected allies became evident during a casual dinner one evening. Margaret, in her typical orchestrated style, attempted to steer the conversation toward family appearances, status, and subtle reminders of her influence. Yet, I noticed how David gently redirected discussions, how Sarah asked pointed questions under the guise of curiosity, and how Lily made observations that, while seemingly innocent, subtly challenged Margaret's narrative. The convergence of these actions, unnoticed by Margaret at the time, demonstrated the emerging strength of the alliances I had begun cultivating. It was a quiet, understated revolution, a collective awareness that could be leveraged strategically when the time was right. Meanwhile, I continued to maintain my careful balance of outward compliance and inward strategy. Margaret's constant surveillance of behavior, her meticulous control over interactions, and her subtle manipulations were as sharp as ever, but now, I was not alone in observing them. The alliances formed through shared observation, empathy, and subtle communication were strengthening my position. The family dynamic, once tightly dominated by Margaret's authority, was beginning to shift imperceptibly. The seeds of collective awareness were planted, and I could sense the potential for influence, disruption, and eventual justice growing quietly beneath the surface. An unexpected revelation, during one of these alliance-building moments, further reinforced the strategy. Sarah confided a piece of information she had discovered inadvertently. Margaret had maintained duplicate records of certain family documents, hidden in a separate safe at the estate. She had no idea the significance at first, but when I explained how this could provide leverage, her eyes widened. "I never thought anyone could figure this out," she whispered. Her awareness, combined with her willingness to collaborate subtly, demonstrated the power of these quiet allies. They were not acting recklessly. They were observing, reflecting, and waiting for the right moment. And together, we began to imagine how Margaret's own secrets could be used strategically, not to humiliate, but to balance the scales of power long skewed in her favor. In these days of careful observation, subtle conversation, and quiet trust-building, I also began to map the emotional landscape of the family. Every alliance, every insight, every shared observation became part of a larger understanding of Margaret's psychology and her methods of control. The more I learned, the clearer it became. True power did not lie solely in the secrets themselves, but in the knowledge, perception, and subtle orchestration of influence. With allies aligned, the strategy for eventual revelation and balance began to take shape, each step measured, deliberate, and precise. By the time several weeks had passed, the unexpected alliances had matured into a silent, powerful force within the family. David, previously cautious, now offered subtle insights and questioned Margaret's narratives with careful phrasing. Sarah, once a competitor in Margaret's eyes, provided critical observations and discreet support. Even Lily, whose youth might have been overlooked, became a perceptive observer, quietly noting inconsistencies and patterns that could later serve as leverage. Together, these unexpected allies had formed an invisible network, poised to shift the family dynamic at the right moment. The alliances were not yet overt. Margaret remained blissfully unaware that the seeds of quiet influence were taking root. But as I reviewed notes, reflected on interactions, and planned the next steps of a silent strategy, I felt a profound sense of empowerment. The knowledge of hidden wealth, the indignation at years of subtle oppression, and now the quiet support of allies created a powerful confluence of opportunity. The family, once dominated by Margaret's meticulous control, was quietly aligning toward a tipping point, one where secrets would be revealed, injustices addressed, and influence redistributed. In the end, the unexpected allies became more than mere participants. They were co-conspirators in a careful orchestration of justice. Their presence, subtle yet critical, ensured that the strategy one had been planning in silence could now incorporate multiple perspectives, observations, and subtle interventions. Margaret's control, long absolute, was now vulnerable, not because of reckless confrontation, but because knowledge, patience, and quiet alignment were forming a force she could not perceive. And as I reflected on the significance of these alliances, I understood that the game had changed irrevocably. I was no longer acting alone, and the next moves would unfold with precision, subtlety, and unrelenting inevitability. The moment had been building for weeks, quietly simmering beneath the surface of polite smiles, subtle observations, and meticulously documented behaviors. Margaret's secret, the hidden bank account that had fueled both my indignation and my silent strategy, had always seemed untouchable, a fortress of wealth and control concealed behind layers of discretion and social performance. I had glimpsed its existence in documents left behind by my late father-in-law, Robert, but it wasn't until the funeral, with its subtle fractures in Margaret's facade, that I realized the timing might finally be right to uncover the full truth. The opportunity presented itself almost accidentally, a convergence of preparation, alliances, and chance that could not be ignored. It was a gray, overcast morning when I decided to act. The house was quiet, Margaret engrossed in arranging the library for a family meeting that would take place later that afternoon. David had stepped out to run errands, and Sarah and Lily were occupied with sorting some old family photographs. The timing was perfect, not forced, not rushed, but carefully chosen. I approached the study, where Margaret's meticulously organized files were usually kept under lock and key. I had observed her routines extensively, the way she retrieved certain documents, the time she left the office unattended, and even the subtle cues she gave when feeling anxious or distracted. Today, all of those observations converged into a precise sequence of action. The first obstacle was the physical barrier, the locked drawer in Margaret's desk, polished to gleaming perfection, which I had watched her use countless times. I remembered noticing a slight smudge on the keyhole weeks ago, a subtle imperfection she likely hadn't noticed, which suggested the most frequently used drawer in her study. I waited until Margaret had left the room momentarily, then approached it cautiously. My hands trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. I had spent days, weeks even, mentally rehearsing this moment, and now, every detail, every observation, every subtle discovery of her habits was coming into play. Using the spare key David had inadvertently left in his study, I slowly unlocked the drawer. The click echoed faintly in the otherwise silent house, sending a thrill of anticipation through me. Inside, files were stacked with methodical precision. Legal documents, property records, and hidden within a thick, manila envelope, the documents that would confirm everything. I held my breath as I removed the envelope, feeling the weight of not only paper but the decades of secrecy it represented. Margaret had kept her wealth, her leverage, and her control hidden for years, and now, finally, it was all within reach. As I opened the envelope, the numbers on the bank statements and financial ledgers practically leapt from the pages. There it was, a fortune that had been meticulously concealed, complete with multiple accounts, transfers, and investments in my father-in-law's name that Margaret had never disclosed. I could feel the years of manipulation, favoritism, and subtle oppression crystallizing into something tangible, proof of the extent of her hidden control. "So this is it," I whispered under my breath, a mix of awe, anger, and a sense of vindication coursing through me. The meticulous record-keeping, the hidden accounts, the subtle manipulations, it was all now visible, concrete, and undeniable. But the discovery wasn't just about money, it was about leverage, understanding, and empowerment. I realized, as I studied the documents, that this knowledge provided not only the factual basis for future action, but also insight into Margaret's psychology. The way she structured her accounts, the timing of deposits, the careful masking of transfers, all of it revealed her habits, priorities, and vulnerabilities. The hidden bank account was more than a secret. It was a map of her influence, her control, and her fears, all captured in financial terms. Each entry told a story, each balance reflected an unspoken narrative, and each transaction revealed the meticulous care with which she maintained her dominion over both wealth and family. I spent hours cross-referencing the documents with notes I had taken over the past weeks, the subtle interactions I had observed, the favoritism I had documented, and the minor inconsistencies Margaret had displayed in her explanations. Every piece fit together like a puzzle, revealing patterns I had suspected but could not confirm until now. The full picture of Margaret's influence, both financial and social, was finally visible. I could see exactly how she had manipulated perceptions, managed loyalty, and concealed control, and I realized that this knowledge gave me a power I had never previously held. It was intoxicating, not in a way of greed, but in a sense of clarity and strategy. The next step was careful contemplation. I could not act rashly. Margaret's vigilance remained formidable, and any misstep could alert her to my awareness. I studied the documents meticulously, noting potential leverage points, vulnerabilities, and opportunities to shift the balance of influence. I made mental calculations, mapped scenarios, and imagined multiple courses of action. Each possibility was weighed against the potential risks and benefits, all while maintaining the outward appearance of calm compliance. The secret bank account had transformed from a hidden repository of wealth into a strategic tool, a key element in the careful orchestration of quiet justice I had been planning for weeks. It was then that Sarah entered the study quietly, observing me with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. I shared only a fraction of what I had discovered, enough to gain her perspective without revealing my full strategy. Her eyes widened as she glanced at the edge of the financial ledgers, and in that moment, I realized the power of alliances. The secret, once confined to Margaret's control, was now a shared piece of knowledge. Between allies who could act discreetly, strategically, and effectively when the time came. Our alliance strengthened, our understanding deepened, and the hidden bank account had become both symbol and instrument of the justice we intended to unfold. I carefully returned the documents to their envelope, ensuring everything appeared undisturbed. Margaret could not suspect that her most guarded secret was now fully known, analyzed, and understood. I left the study with a quiet sense of triumph, tempered by the understanding that the real challenge lay ahead, the careful, patient, and deliberate use of this knowledge to create balance, accountability, and the eventual shift in power within the family. The secret bank account was more than a discovery. It was the catalyst, the turning point, and the foundation for the next phase of our plan. Later that evening, as I reviewed my notes and the financial statements in private, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. Every calculation, every observed behavior, and every subtle interaction now formed a comprehensive map of Margaret's control, waiting for the right moment to be leveraged. I knew that the revelation of his hidden wealth would not just alter perceptions, it would shift power dynamics, expose truths long concealed, and serve as the critical turning point in the carefully orchestrated journey toward justice and revenge. The discovery of the secret bank was more than an achievement. It was a validation of patience, observation, and strategic thinking. It marked the moment when knowledge became power, and power became the tool through which long-suppressed truths could finally emerge. The quiet alliances, the meticulous planning, and the careful observation all converged in that single act of discovery. And as I closed the envelope, securing both the documents and the potential they represented, I knew that everything had changed. The game was no longer theoretical, it was real, and the moves I would make next could alter the family forever. By the time I decided to confront Margaret, the plan had been polished down to a sequence of small, deliberate moves, each one timed, rehearsed, and supported by the quiet allies I'd nurtured. It felt less like an accusation, and more like a carefully choreographed reveal, a gradual unspooling of truth designed to be undeniable and to leave no room for her practiced evasions. I had learned that Margaret thrived on theater. She controlled rooms, edited conversations, and staged sympathy when convenient. My aim was to use the same stage to shine a light so clear that even she could not redirect the script. I chose an ordinary Tuesday evening for the confrontation, a family dinner at our house that would, by design, mimic the social rituals Margaret had always manipulated. There would be no shouting, no dramatics. Instead, I planned for quiet clarity. The guests were the people who mattered: David, whose confusion had transformed into cautious conviction; Sarah, whose discreet support had surprised me with its sincerity; Lily, whose sharp observations would later prove useful; and a handful of other relatives who, through casual curiosity, had edged closer to seeing Margaret's pattern. We kept the group small on purpose. Intimacy reduced the chance of deflection, and familiarity would make the evidence harder to dismiss as malice. Before anyone arrived, I set the table with care, every plate and glass perfectly aligned. The setting was a subtle psychological tool, familiar, domestic, and non-threatening. I wanted the evening to feel like any other family meal, nothing more than polite conversation over roast and pie. Margaret arrived punctually, in a tasteful navy dress, her posture as composed as ever. She gave the room her practiced smile, and for an instant my old unease flickered. Then I steadied myself. The envelope with the bank statements lay folded and concealed in the top drawer of the sideboard, accessible but not on display. The confrontation would not hinge on theatrical brandishing of documents. Instead, it would be built on questions that guided witnesses to see what the documents already proved. We ate with the sort of small talk that family meals disguise themselves with: the weather, the neighbor's new dog, the banalities that protect the unspoken. Margaret was at ease, which only made my focus sharper. Between courses, I guided the conversation toward memories of Robert and the estate, neutral ground where fact and feeling mingled. I asked David to tell a story about his father. He obliged, voice steady, and as he spoke, I watched Margaret like a hawk. She interrupted once, gently correcting a detail. The room accepted her amendment as deference to age. That tiny automatic deference, the habit of privileging her voice, was exactly what I intended to dismantle. As dessert arrived, lemon tart, Sarah's specialty, I made my move with the calm of someone who had practiced 100 times. I said lightly, "You know, when my father passed, there were so many papers to sort through. I found it surprising how some things were clear and others weren't." My voice was conversational. I let the words hang. Margaret's eyes flicked to me, searching for a tone of accusation she could rebuff. I kept my gaze neutral. "We discovered a few accounts and records," I continued. "Some were as expected, others unexpected." The phrase landed like a pebble in still water, small, but the ripples were inevitable. David's hand found mine beneath the table. He squeezed once, silent solidarity. Sarah excused herself to put the kettle on, and Lily, sensing a shift, watched with open attention. Margaret's smile hardened into a polite question. "What accounts?" she asked, voice smooth. I smiled back, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Oh, just some documents Robert had kept. Ledgers, statements. It's been important for sorting the estate. I actually found a set of files in your desk the other day." Her breath caught for the briefest instant. There it was again, the microcognitive glitch I trained myself to recognize. She composed herself instantly. "My desk. I can't imagine," she began, but I cut in with the gentleness of inevitability. "You know I only looked because we were trying to reconcile all the paperwork for taxes," I said. "It was tedious work, matching names, dates, accounts. I noticed a pattern of transfers and a separate set of statements in Robert's name." I kept talking as if describing the weather, but the tone was deliberate. "It looks like several accounts were consolidated and managed in a way that wasn't transparent. I thought it best we all review it together, so everything is clear." I could see Margaret calculating her response. She had a reflexive arsenal, minimization, charm, diversion, but she had never had to face a measured, collective curiosity before. That was the advantage of allies. Once a few people leaned toward questioning, the social pressure to accept her narrative weakened. I reached for the envelope and set it gently on the table without opening it. "I brought a copy of the records I noticed," I said. "We can look at them together right now." The act was unremarkable, the movement of a hand, a routine gesture that belied its content. Margaret's voice, when it came, was an artful mix of surprise and wounded dignity. "Why would you do that? Why bring family business here?" she asked. David answered before I did, patient but firm. "Because transparency is family business, Mom. If there are irregular accounts or funds in Dad's name, we should know. This isn't about blame. It's about understanding what happened." He was careful to use words that felt reasonable and non-accusatory. His tone was crucial. It framed the conversation not as an attack, but as responsible stewardship. One by one, I opened the envelopes and spread the statements across the table. The numbers were there, uncaring, concrete. Transfers into accounts we had never seen, deposits made in discrete amounts and moved into investments that bore Margaret's signature as a trustee. The quiet in the room deepened, like the hush in a theater when the lights dim and the first notes of a requiem begin. I narrated calmly, pointing out dates that aligned with major family events, deposits that corresponded with petty shifts in favor, and transfers that had quietly grown over years. The patterns were obvious, once arranged before our eyes. Margaret's composure was strained now. She tried to speak, explanations rehearsed in the quiet of her life, but the presence of witnesses who had begun to connect dots changed the dynamics. Sarah looked stunned. Lily frowned, then tilted her head as if a puzzle had just rearranged itself. David's jaw tightened, and I saw sorrow and betrayal flicker through his expression. "You kept Dad's money," he asked quietly. "You decided who would know and who wouldn't." Margaret's defense began with practiced neutrality. "I managed things. I took responsibility for the estate." But the language of guardianship didn't hold when confronted with tangible evidence. I let her speak while I watched the family react. The key to the confrontation was not to win an argument, but to replace the narrative she had controlled for decades with one that the family now saw for themselves. Evidence makes stories stick. She had thrived on the family believing her version of events. Now the story was being rewritten in the sober columns of bank statements and ledger entries. At a point when Margaret's explanations frayed, I invited the group to consider the human cost, not merely the money. "It's not just numbers," I said softly. "It's about decisions that shaped our lives, who received support, who was left out, and how secrecy allowed manipulation." I spoke of small injustices, holidays rearranged, favors granted, opportunities withheld. The examples were not dramatic, they were familiar, quotidian slights that everyone at the table recognized in their bones. Each recollection linked a ledger entry to a face, a withheld opportunity to a childhood memory, or a missed promise. The room held those memories like fragile china. Margaret's eyes began to shift from defense to calculation. She still hoped to salvage respectability, an apology, a reframe, any gesture to keep authority intact. I had anticipated this and had prepared a path for it. "We can do this the right way," I offered. "We'll review these records together. If mistakes were made, we can correct them. If anything needs to be legally addressed, we will. But it must be transparent. The words were firm, reasonable, and left a door open for dignity while demanding accountability. In the days that followed, the confrontation rippled through the family like sound through glass. Margaret attempted to maintain normalcy, calls, polite dinners, the same composure, but the balance had shifted. The planned confrontation had not been a scorched earth attack, it was a recalibration. It invited accountability, leveraged evidence, and redistributed power not through spectacle but through collective recognition. Allies continued to watch, to document, and to support the process of truth. Margaret could still try to spin, but now she had to contend with witnesses who had seen records with their own eyes. The night of the confrontation, I felt something more than vindication. There was a solemn satisfaction that comes when careful preparation meets just timing. Revenge, in the way I had imagined it, was not about humiliation. It was about restoring a sense of justice with the precision of quiet strategy. Margaret had used secrecy as her way of ruling. I had used transparency as my way of restoring balance. The planned confrontation did not end everything. It began a slow, necessary reordering. And as the family gathered the next day to begin the formal review of documents, I knew that the future would be different. Less choreographed by one woman's hands and more shared, messy, and honest in the ways family life ought to be. The morning air was crisp and quiet, carrying with it a sense of inevitability that seemed almost tangible. I awoke early, restless, knowing that today would mark a turning point, the culmination of weeks of careful observation, patient strategizing, and subtle alignment with unexpected allies. Margaret had been masterful for decades, controlling perceptions, allocating attention, and masking her ambitions behind a veneer of grace. But the hidden bank account, now fully documented and understood, had provided the leverage that would finally bring clarity, accountability, and the long-awaited exposure of her secret to the family. This was the moment when careful planning intersected with opportunity, transforming latent power into action. The day began innocuously. I prepared the living room, arranging furniture and family photographs to create a sense of normalcy. Everything was intended to appear casual, but in reality, it was meticulously orchestrated. Positioning, timing, and sightlines were all considered. The key was to allow the exposure to unfold naturally, like a slow sunrise, so that Margaret could not deflect or control the narrative. I had learned from previous confrontations that overt aggression would trigger defense and manipulation. Instead, subtlety and clarity would be far more effective. The family began to arrive, each person stepping into the house with the expectation of another polite gathering. David entered first, his expression betraying a mixture of apprehension and quiet determination. Sarah followed, carrying a tray of tea, and Lily trailed behind, her curiosity uncontained. Even distant relatives joined, unaware of the delicate tension that would soon transform the room. Margaret arrived last, as always, radiating composure. Her smile, rehearsed and flawless, was met with polite nods and soft greetings. She had no idea that the carefully hidden truths she thought were secure would soon come into full light. I invited everyone to sit, offering tea and light conversation. Margaret took her usual position at the head of the table, a gesture of authority she had performed countless times. I allowed her to settle, giving the illusion that she remained in control. Then, with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed every detail, I began to recount the story of Robert's estate. I did so not with accusations, but with documented facts, gradually weaving a narrative that would make Margaret's concealment impossible to ignore. Over the past few weeks, I began, we've been reviewing the estate and the various accounts Robert had in his name. There were the usual, expected accounts, savings, investments, but then we found others. Accounts that were hidden, accounts that had been carefully managed to exclude certain family members. My voice was steady, deliberate, creating a rhythm that drew attention without triggering defensiveness. Margaret's smile flickered, just for a moment, as she sensed the direction of the conversation. I slowly reached for the envelope containing the bank statements, ensuring that the motion was casual, almost incidental. The family's eyes followed me, curious but unalerted to the significance of the movement. These documents, I continued, reveal a pattern of management that I think none of us were fully aware of. Decisions were made, funds were allocated, and certain details kept secret, decisions that affected how the estate would be distributed and who had access to resources. I paused, letting the words hang, giving space for comprehension, shock, and reflection to settle among the family. David leaned forward, his expression sober. "Mom," he said carefully, addressing Margaret, "we need to understand why these accounts were hidden, why we were kept from seeing them." His voice was gentle yet firm, the product of weeks of private reflection and alliance building. Margaret's hands clenched subtly in her lap, her carefully curated composure starting to fray. She attempted to interject, but the room's focus had shifted. Attention was no longer hers to control. I opened the envelope and began to distribute copies of the statements and financial ledgers to the family. Each sheet, each number, each entry was indisputable. The evidence was not rhetorical, it was tangible. The room fell silent as relatives absorbed the reality of Margaret's secret. Deposits, transfers, and consolidated accounts, all orchestrated in her favor or hidden entirely, were now visible for everyone to see. The ledger entries aligned with family events, holidays, and other occasions, revealing a careful pattern of control and selective generosity. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she examined the statements. I didn't know," she whispered. "All these years, we thought Dad was managing everything, but it was—" Her words faltered, the truth too stark to be summarized in a single sentence. Lily, seated on the floor with crossed legs, tilted her head as she traced numbers with her finger, her brow furrowed in confusion and dawning. "Understanding? Why would she hide it?" she asked aloud. The question, innocent yet profound, echoed in the room. Margaret's response was measured but strained. "I was protecting the family," she said, her tone faltering slightly. "I only wanted what was best." But the narrative she had rehearsed for years, control disguised as care, now collided with evidence that she could no longer contextualize, explain away, or manipulate. Each ledger entry, each transaction, each carefully hidden account was a small hammer striking at the foundation of her control. I continued with calm precision. "We're not here to attack anyone personally," I said. "But these documents show decisions made in secrecy that affected all of us. Transparency is necessary if we are to honor Robert's legacy correctly and fairly." The statements in front of everyone transformed the discussion from one of emotion and conjecture into one of fact, accountability, and undeniable truth. Margaret's authority was no longer absolute. It had been redistributed by the very transparency she had sought to avoid. The impact was profound. Relatives exchanged glances, whispered quietly, and referenced past events now illuminated in a new light. Examples of favoritism, previously dismissed as misperceptions or benign mistakes, were now corroborated by the documentation. Patterns of influence, exclusion, and selective generosity became apparent. Margaret, once the uncontested orchestrator of family perception, was now subject to collective awareness, a quiet but absolute exposure of her secret. The room's energy shifted from tension to contemplation. There was grief, certainly, for the betrayal that the ledgers revealed. But there was also a sense of justice, subtle and restorative, as the family began to grasp the truth for themselves. My role was not to punish, it was to illuminate, to allow transparency and clarity to restore balance. The secret, once a fortress, was now a shared reality, undeniable and inescapable. By the end of the day, Margaret had retreated into quiet reflection. The family had begun to process the revelation in hushed conversations, each person connecting dots and reassessing prior experiences through the lens of evidence. The exposure of the secret had not destroyed the family. It had altered the dynamics irrevocably, establishing a new foundation for trust, accountability, and careful vigilance. The careful alliances I had nurtured provided support and perspective, ensuring that the moment of revelation was not chaotic but controlled, deliberate, and ultimately empowering. As evening fell and shadows stretched across the estate, I sat quietly, reflecting on the magnitude of the day. The exposure of the secret was not merely a personal triumph, it was the manifestation of strategy, patience, and subtle influence. Margaret's era of unchecked control had ended, replaced by a landscape of awareness, scrutiny, and collective agency. The hidden bank account, once a symbol of her dominion, had become the catalyst for transparency and justice. And as I looked around the room at the family, somber, reflective, and quietly connected, I knew that the ripples of this revelation would continue to shape relationships, loyalties, and decisions for years to come. The exposure of the secret had changed everything, but the story was far from over. The family now faced the difficult task of reconciliation, realignment, and rebuilding trust, while Margaret confronted a new reality, one in which her authority could no longer dictate the narrative. The quiet empowerment of knowledge, transparency, and strategic alliance had shifted the balance, proving that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of finding the light. And when they do, the consequences are inevitable, transformative, and unforgettable. The moment the secret was exposed, the room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a fragile balance between disbelief, shock, and a dawning sense of clarity. The ledger entries, the hidden bank accounts, and the meticulously documented transfers lay spread across the dining table like evidence in a court of law. Each number represented years of secrecy, control, and manipulation, and now they were visible for everyone to see. The family, who had spent decades navigating Margaret's subtle favoritism and hidden influence, faced a reality that was undeniable, incontrovertible, and emotionally overwhelming. The room, once filled with casual chatter and polite smiles, transformed into a charged theater of raw, unfiltered emotion. David, usually composed and rational, was the first to speak. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes scanning the statements with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. "All these years, you kept this from us." His voice, quiet yet heavy with weight, resonated through the room. Margaret's practiced composure flickered, like a candle struggling against a sudden gust of wind. She opened her mouth, perhaps to justify herself, perhaps to reclaim the narrative, but the evidence had already shifted the balance. Her authority, previously absolute, had been subtly dismantled by the sheer clarity of transparency. Sarah, sitting beside me, held a copy of the documents in her hands as if they were both fragile and incendiary. Her expression oscillated between hurt and awakening. She had been one of the beneficiaries of Margaret's favor, yet the revelations now made her question the very foundations of those relationships. "I never realized how selective everything was," she whispered, almost to herself. The holidays, the gifts, the opportunities, it was all carefully measured. Her words, though soft, struck the room with their truth. Every relative present could now see the impact of Margaret's hidden control, and the subtle injustices that had been normalized for decades were suddenly undeniable. Even the younger family members, often overlooked in such high-stakes family politics, reacted with clarity that was surprisingly precise. Lily, David's cousin, whose perceptiveness had been a quiet advantage throughout the planning process, furrowed her brow and spoke plainly. "Why would anyone hide something like this? It doesn't make sense." Her voice, simple and unsentimental, cut through the layers of social politeness that Margaret had always relied upon. Children, teenagers, and young adults often see things adults miss. They perceive inequity without the filters of habit or loyalty. In this case, Lily's clarity reinforced the impact of the exposure. Margaret's long-standing strategy of controlled perception had failed to account for the unfiltered judgment of youth. Family members whispered among themselves, quietly connecting dots and sharing memories now illuminated by the revelations. Aunt Eleanor mentioned how certain family vacations had been arranged to favor some grandchildren over others. Uncle Martin recalled moments when funding for educational opportunities had mysteriously appeared for one child but not another. Each anecdote, once fragmented and dismissed as coincidence or generosity, now aligned perfectly with the financial evidence laid before them. Patterns of favoritism, previously hidden under a veil of plausibility, were now tangible and undeniable. Margaret's meticulous orchestration of appearances could no longer shield her from scrutiny. I noticed that the room's atmosphere shifted again when the first acknowledgement of betrayal emerged. Not anger, but recognition. Eyes that had once deferred to Margaret's authority now held critical awareness. The family members no longer saw her merely as the matriarch, but as a figure whose decisions had tangible consequences for each of them. The ledger entries had not only revealed financial secrets, but had also illuminated years of subtle manipulation. Trust, long taken for granted, now required reevaluation. Questions arose. tentative at first, then more pointed, as the family sought to reconcile their experiences with the newly revealed facts. Margaret attempted to intervene, her voice calm and measured, yet each word now seemed to fall flat against the unyielding clarity of evidence. "I only acted in the family's best interest," she said, her hands pressing lightly against the table for support. But the ledger entries were factual, unemotional, and unassailable. No words, however polished, could erase their reality. Her attempts at reframing were met with silence, punctuated by the quiet turning of pages and murmurs of disbelief. She was no longer orchestrating the narrative, she was responding to it, constrained by the truth she had hidden for decades. As the family digested the revelations, emotions varied widely. Shock gave way to indignation in some, curiosity in others, and quiet contemplation in many. The range of reactions revealed the depth of the impact. Margaret had not only concealed wealth but had subtly shaped decisions, behaviors, and perceptions for decades. The exposure now created a collective understanding of the dynamics that had long been invisible, allowing family members to process years of favoritism, inequity, and subtle manipulation. David, still scanning the documents, finally looked up and addressed the family with a tone of resolution. "We need to handle this together. It's not just about the money, it's about fairness, transparency, and integrity. We can't let these patterns continue unnoticed." His words carried authority without aggression, a tone that emphasized accountability over retribution. In doing so, he modeled a response that balanced emotional honesty with strategic clarity, guiding the family toward a path of reconciliation and justice. Sarah, emboldened by the collective awareness, added, "We've seen the proof. Now it's time we make sure that future decisions are fair for everyone." Her voice, previously quiet and reserved, now carried the weight of conviction. The alignment of our perspectives, hers, David's, Lily's, and mine, had subtly shifted the balance of power within the family. No longer controlled by fear, deference, or secrecy, the family was beginning to operate with a shared understanding, capable of holding even Margaret accountable. The younger members began asking questions that cut to the heart of fairness. Why did Dad not know about these accounts sooner? How did she decide who deserved what? What does this mean for us going forward? These questions, though innocent, exposed the ethical implications of Margaret's secrecy. They highlighted not only the injustice, but also the importance of transparency and the need to ensure that family decisions were made collectively rather than unilaterally. Margaret's expressions shifted throughout this unfolding. First, a flicker of panic, then indignation, and finally a hesitant acknowledgement that she had underestimated both the resilience and the insight of her family. The room, once carefully controlled by her authority, was now navigating truth collectively. Allies who had previously acted quietly now supported one another openly, observing patterns, asking clarifying questions, and ensuring that the narrative was rooted in reality, not the matriarch's carefully constructed version. By the evening, after hours of quiet but intense conversation, a sense of equilibrium began to emerge. The family had processed the shock, articulated grievances, and acknowledged the facts. Margaret remained present, constrained by evidence, while the family collectively began to recalibrate relationships, expectations, and trust. Transparency, though difficult, had empowered the family to step into a dynamic where control was shared rather than monopolized, and where secrecy no longer dictated perception or decision-making. I observed this transformation with quiet satisfaction. The exposure of the secret had achieved its intended effect, revealing decades of subtle favoritism, reshaping the family's understanding of equity, and creating a foundation for accountability. But the work was far from over. The family had seen the evidence, felt the impact, and begun the necessary conversations, but Margaret's response, the unfolding consequences, and the long-term restructuring of power dynamics would continue to evolve. In that charged, reflective space, I realized that exposure alone was not the end. It was the catalyst for dialogue, for recalibration, and for subtle but irreversible shifts in family dynamics. The ledger entries, once hidden, had altered perceptions, provoked reflection, and sparked the collective realization that control, once absolute, could be challenged through truth and strategic alignment. Margaret had lost the narrative, the family had gained clarity, cohesion, and the awareness necessary to prevent further manipulation. By nightfall, the household was quieter, the emotional resonance lingering in the corners of each room. Relatives whispered in small groups, processing implications, aligning perspectives, and sharing memories reframed by evidence. The family's reaction had been multifaceted: shock, indignation, reflection, but above all, it was unifying. The exposure of the secret was no longer just a revelation. It had become a turning point, the moment when power shifted quietly but decisively, creating an environment where truth, transparency, and accountability could flourish. The days that followed the family confrontation were quiet but charged, as though the house itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Margaret moved through the rooms with her usual grace, but there was an undeniable shift in the air. Her authority, once unchallenged and absolute, had been subtly dismantled by the transparency that had finally pierced her carefully maintained veil of control. The exposure of the hidden accounts had initiated a ripple effect throughout the family, a ripple that would now cascade into every conversation, every decision, and every gesture. Yet, my victory was silent. It was measured, deliberate, and deeply personal. I did not need dramatics, accusations, or grand displays. The power of knowledge, evidence, and strategic alignment had done what anger and confrontation never could. I spent the morning reviewing the documents again, ensuring that every ledger entry, every statement, and every transaction had been accounted for. The days after Margaret's secrets were fully exposed unfolded in a strange, almost surreal rhythm, like walking through a house that was both familiar and forever changed. Each room echoed with remnants of past conversations, of unspoken resentments, and of moments long buried under the weight of carefully constructed appearances. Yet now, there was a new clarity, an unspoken understanding among the family members that the dynamics had shifted irreversibly. The hidden accounts, once tools of manipulation, had been transformed into symbols of accountability, transparency, and the subtle empowerment of those who had once been silenced. I observed this transformation with a mix of relief, satisfaction, and cautious optimism, knowing that the true test of change was not in exposure, but in what came after, the recalibration of relationships, decisions, and trust. In the mornings, I would sit quietly at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in hand, watching the family move through routines that now felt lighter, more genuine. David would read the newspaper in the corner, occasionally exchanging glances with Sarah, whose soft smile had returned, tempered now by awareness rather than naive compliance. Lily, curious and perceptive as ever, asked questions about everything, from finances to family history to small decisions about holidays and traditions. The atmosphere was not devoid of tension, but it was tension rooted in awareness, reflection, and the cautious rebuilding of equilibrium. Each conversation, each interaction, carried the imprint of the revelations that had so recently rocked our world. The reflection of the past weeks weighed heavily on me. I thought of the careful planning, the alliances forged quietly, the patience required to wait for the perfect moment to expose Margaret's deception. Every step had been deliberate, every choice calculated, and every word measured. Yet, more than strategy, I realized that the silent victories, the subtle shifts in perception, the growing awareness among the family members, the establishment of accountability, were what truly mattered. These were the victories that could endure, shaping not only the present but the family's future in profound, lasting ways. Margaret, aware of her diminished authority, but still navigating her role with practiced grace, now approached interactions with a tempered presence. Her attempts to influence decisions were met with careful consideration, thoughtful dialogue, and, occasionally, gentle pushback. The matriarch, once the uncontested orchestrator of family dynamics, was now operating within boundaries defined by transparency and collective awareness. Her influence remained, but it was moderated, softened by the fact that the family had observed, understood, and responded to her actions. The subtle balance of power had shifted, and the family was now capable of asserting itself without conflict, using insight and unity rather than confrontation alone. As the weeks turned into months, the long-term effects of the exposure became increasingly evident. Decisions about inheritance, holidays, family events, and financial management were no longer unilateral. Discussions that once seemed trivial were now informed by collective understanding and shared accountability. Patterns of favoritism and hidden control, once invisible and unchallenged, had been replaced by transparency and equitable consideration. The house, once a theater for subtle manipulation, had become a space of shared responsibility, respect, and cautious optimism. The family, though still navigating emotions and past grievances, was functioning in a dynamic that prioritized fairness, dialogue, and clarity. I spent quiet evenings reflecting on my journey, often sitting alone in the garden as the sun dipped below the horizon. The silence of the estate, once charged with unspoken tensions, now felt contemplative, like a space for reflection and quiet triumph. I thought of the mother-in-law, whose secrets had once seemed invincible, the daughter-in-law, who had been underestimated, yet now wielded insight and strategic patience, and the family, who had, collectively, reclaimed agency and awareness. The exposure of the hidden bank accounts had not only shifted control but had illuminated the consequences of secrecy, manipulation, and deception. It had shown the power of knowledge, patience, and careful planning, and the lasting impact that truth could have on relationships and dynamics. Yet reflection was not merely about victory. It was about understanding the subtleties of human behavior, the complexities of familial relationships, and the delicate balance between justice and compassion. I realized that Margaret, despite her manipulation, was also a product of her upbringing, experiences, and fears. Her secrecy had been driven by control, certainly, but also by a desire to shape outcomes according to what she believed was best. Understanding this did not excuse her actions, but it allowed me to approach the future with clarity, empathy, and purpose. The silent victories, the exposure, and the recalibration of family dynamics were all pieces of a larger narrative, one in which awareness, accountability, and strategic action were paramount. The family's future now rested on the foundation of collective understanding. David, Sarah, Lily, and others had begun to engage in open dialogues, establishing norms for transparency and accountability that would guide decisions for years to come. Family gatherings were still emotional, and discussions about legacy and finances could sometimes become tense, but the awareness of past manipulation ensured that no one could dominate unchecked. The lessons learned from exposure and reaction were now encoded into family culture. Fairness, transparency, and collective voice had replaced secrecy, favoritism, and unilateral control. The estate, the finances, and the relationships were now conduits for trust rather than tools of power. I often watched Margaret quietly, noting the subtleties of her behavior. She had adapted in ways both conscious and unconscious, careful, controlled, measured, but her ability to manipulate had been permanently moderated by the awareness and unity of the family. Even small gestures, once capable of reshaping perception, now required scrutiny and thoughtful response. Her presence remained, but it was contextualized within a framework of transparency, vigilance, and collective accountability. The past deceptions had been exposed, and the consequences had shifted the family dynamic irreversibly. One evening, as I reviewed old photographs of past holidays and family gatherings, I saw patterns that had once seemed innocuous but were now illuminated by the lens of awareness. The favoritism, the selective generosity, the subtle manipulations, all became visible, instructive, and cautionary. The reflection allowed me to understand not only what had occurred but also how to ensure that the lessons of exposure endured. The family's future would now be guided by deliberate choice, transparency, and mutual respect. The silent victory had created a space where informed decisions, equitable treatment, and accountability were not ideals but lived realities. Even the youngest family members had begun to grasp the importance of transparency and fairness. Lily, for example, would ask thoughtful questions about decisions, opportunities, and family history, demonstrating that awareness and knowledge could prevent the repetition of past injustices. The exposure had not only shifted adult perceptions, but had also educated the next generation, ensuring that the values of honesty, fairness, and strategic insight would carry forward. In this way, the consequences of the past extended beyond immediate resolution, shaping behavior, expectations, and relationships for decades to come. As the sun set and evening shadows stretched across the estate, I reflected on the journey from secrecy to transparency, from manipulation to accountability, and from quiet tension to informed equilibrium. The mother-in-law's secrets, once a source of power, had catalyzed transformation, fostering unity, awareness, and insight. The silent victories, the recalibration of authority, and the reflective conversations had created a family capable of navigating complexity with discernment, empathy, and justice. The past had been confronted, the present was measured, and the future, though uncertain, was guided by awareness, integrity, and collective empowerment. I sat quietly, absorbing the stillness, knowing that the true triumph lay not in drama or confrontation, but in the subtle, enduring shift of power, perception, and understanding. Margaret's influence had been tempered, but the family had been strengthened. The hidden accounts had become instruments of justice rather than tools of manipulation. And as night settled over the estate, I understood that the future was no longer dictated by secrecy, control, or favoritism, but by knowledge, strategic patience, and the deliberate exercise of fairness, integrity, and collective awareness. The reflection revealed the most profound truth. Power wielded without transparency is fragile, secrecy cannot withstand scrutiny, and the patient, deliberate pursuit of justice, quiet, thoughtful, and strategic, can reshape relationships, dynamics, and legacies forever. The family had endured, learned, and transformed. The secrets had been exposed, but more importantly, the family had reclaimed its agency, its voice, and its future.